Now, I was wondering when we were going to talk about Marie Iannuzzi, and I'm wondering if now isn't kind of a good time to kind of bring that in just briefly. Marie Iannuzzi was a woman who was found murdered in 1979, so this was prior to Joan's disappearance and murder. But nonetheless, it's somewhat significant. Let's just, if you could, just take us through Marie's, what happened with her and her boyfriend, David Doyle, and just briefly, and then we'll get right back to Joan.
Okay, well, in order to preface that, if I can take a minute and try to describe what the climate was like at this time. Mm-hmm. Boston, and these were things I really have had to study and really had to understand, and I'm not sure that they were things that were readily apparent to anyone at the time. I mean, some of it certainly was. There was a lot of organized crime in Boston. There were two major factions. There was the mafia and there was the Irish mob. What wasn't necessarily known at the time was the corruption in the FBI office. The FBI office was extremely corrupt, and it was very deeply rooted. It had been for many years. There are cases where FBI agents knowingly and intentionally protected criminal informants, murderers, and wrongfully convicted people to cover up take the blame for the crimes. Also at the same time, the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office, which is the office at that time that handled Joan's case and handled the other case that you just referenced, Marie Iannuzzi, they were found in 1991 to have been very corrupt. They were found to have had secret and duplicate files that were held within their office, holding back, exculpatory evidence for defendants in cases that went from 1980 to 1988, when the homicide division was being handled by a man by the name of John Kiernan. He was the lawyer in that office that took care of that and dealt with the homicide cases. So this certainly all fell in there.
Now, Marie, her boyfriend's name was David Doyle.
From the testimony that came out in that trial, he most definitely had all the appearances with a certain police officer of being an informant. They met on multiple occasions, undocumented meetings, and he certainly was in a hotbed and in a position where he would provide information to keep himself off the hook. He was a drug user, and he pushed.
Yeah. So but the relationship with this particular officer was more like that of an informant, but they definitely had, he met with this officer 20, 30 times and supplied information.
Absolutely.
Okay, and David had a girlfriend named Marie Iannuzzi who they had a pretty volatile relationship.
They lived together. Okay. And they had an extremely volatile and abusive relationship, one that was known by, her family and people surrounding them. They lived in an upstairs apartment of his parents' home in East Boston, and they had gone to a wedding. This was in August of 1979. The groom was a cousin of David Doyle's. And during the course of that afternoon, during the reception that they had at a restaurant there, he had ripped his pants, and David Doyle and Marie Iannuzzi got into a very heated argument that was witnessed by, everyone who was there as a part of the wedding. And he decided not to go on to a house party later that night, and Marie went on without him. She proceeded to get extremely intoxicated and was asked by the family to leave the party, which she did not, and when they called her a cab. And finally, the father of the groom asked one of the guests if she would give Miss Iannuzzi a ride back to her home. The guest obliged, but Marie did not want to go home, so she was dropped off at a bar in East Boston, about 2 blocks from where she lived. the relationship of David Doyle. Earlier that summer, there was an incident where she had gone over and spent some time at a girlfriend's house staying with her because David Doyle had been extremely aggressive with her, left strangulation and finger marks on her neck, and she was terrified. And sadly, yes, we learned that, you don't go back to a situation like that, but she did.
Mm-hmm. Now, the night she was dropped off at the bar, was that the last night she was seen alive?
She died that night.
She died that night.
Or the next morning. She was murdered.
And what sort of circumstantial evidence was there that pointed to her boyfriend, David Doyle? Was there blood somewhere?
Yes, there was blood found on a step that led up to their apartment. He was seen having terrible gouge and scratch marks on his hands, and also even one above and below one of his eyes. He had Marie's belongings all packed up prior to the body being identified, and he took off and left town the day of the funeral. He was arrested in Newark, New Jersey. He gave a false name, and the name he gave happened to be a stepbrother of Marie Iannuzzi's. It was one of her family members' names.
So it looks like he had some pretty strong circumstantial evidence against David Doyle.
Absolutely.
Now, let me just interject here and say that the police officer, this is a name I'm going to give our listeners now, the police officer who met 20, 30 times with David Doyle and supplied him with information, this officer's name was Trooper Andrew Palumbo.
That's correct.
And that is very significant later on in our stories, ladies and gentlemen, but I did just want to give a little background. Now, David Doyle was never charged with Marie's murder, and he was never even looked at. Isn't that correct?
Well, he was looked at. In that case, it was considered there were two suspects, and one of them was David Doyle, and the other one was a man by the name of Leonard Paradiso, who happened to also have been a guest at that wedding. And it was his girlfriend that had given Marie the ride to the bar, and they located some of her belongings in her car later that night, and Mr. Paradiso went and returned them to her at the bar. They were seen exiting the bar at the same time. What happened in the case was it really went cold, and Trooper Palumbo was not the initial officer that assigned as the lead investigator on the case, but later in time, February of 1981, he was. He became the lead investigator on that case, and he met with this man on numerous occasions without documenting anything, without recording anything, and certainly not in any way that you would interview someone that was a suspect in a murder case.